A bride decides to run away with another wealthy man on her wedding day when she learns that her husband has lost his job, but upon returning, she has a big surprise that makes her regret her choice. Robert lived a quiet and predictable life. Since he was a child, he always understood the value of hard work and honesty. Raised by humble parents in a modest home in a distant neighborhood of the city, he learned to appreciate every achievement. His father, a worker at a small electrical repair company, always told him that the most important thing in life was to hold your head high. His mother, a dedicated homemaker, reinforced these teachings through simple gestures, like daily care for the family and respect for the neighbors. Robert grew up absorbing these values, believing that life could be tough, but hard work would always be rewarded. In his teenage years, while many of his friends dreamed of leaving town to seek adventures in big urban centers, Robert preferred to focus on his studies and help his father in his spare time. He never had big financial ambitions. What he wanted was to live a stable life and build a family based on love and trust, just like his parents had done. After finishing school, he began working at a small local company. Initially, he held simple positions, but his dedication and work ethic soon caught the attention of his superiors. In a few years, he was promoted to manager, a position he took pride in. It wasn't a glamorous job, but Robert felt he was fulfilling his duty. He was respected by his colleagues and had a close relationship with his team, always ready to help and listen. By the time he turned 30, Robert was already established. He had bought a small house not far from his parents' place and maintained a calm routine. His social life was modest, with occasional meetups with childhood friends and family dinners on weekends. He was never one for big parties or trips. Everything he did revolved around his family and work. Robert's parents were pleased with the man he had become. Even with limited resources, they managed to instill in him what they believed to be the true values of life: simplicity, honesty, and respect for others. It was during one of those rare moments of relaxation that everything began to change. On an ordinary weekend, one of his closest friends, Donald, invited him to a small gathering with a group of acquaintances. Robert, who usually didn't attend social events outside his family's circle, decided to accept the invitation as a way to mix up his routine a bit. It was there, in that casual and carefree atmosphere, that he met Betty. Betty was the opposite of everything Robert knew. Of seemingly more affluent origins, she exuded a confidence and elegance that immediately caught his attention. It wasn't just Betty's physical beauty that impressed him, but the way she dominated the conversation, always wearing a confident smile. She seemed to know what she wanted and wasn't afraid to go after it. That night, Betty's gaze met Robert several times, and he found himself intrigued by this woman who seemed so different from everything he was familiar with. What began as a shy exchange of glances soon evolved into light, unpretentious conversations. Robert, with his straightforward and simple demeanor, felt at ease with Betty. She, in turn, seemed intrigued by the simplicity and honesty that Robert conveyed. In the following days, the two began to see each other more frequently. At first, they were casual outings, without commitment. Betty seemed to enjoy Robert's company, even though he came from a different world. She appreciated how he spoke about life with a naturalness she rarely found in the people around her. For Robert, his interest in Betty grew gradually. He, who had never allowed himself to become involved in deep romantic relationships, began to realize that he missed Betty on the days he didn't see her. Their conversations, once casual, became longer and more personal. Betty shared her dreams and ambitions, many of which revolved around material comfort and a life of luxury. Robert, though aware of their differences, believed that the feelings between them could overcome any obstacle. But the reality was that, while Robert saw Betty as a possibility for the future, his family did not share the same enthusiasm. From the first moment Robert introduced Betty to his parents, they sensed that something wasn't quite right. Betty was friendly, but there was something in her behavior that unsettled Robert's mother. She felt that Betty did not share the same values that had always been so important to their family. Betty talked a lot about travel, expensive dinners, and social events, while for them, the essence was being together, regardless of material possessions. Robert's father, always quieter and more observant, also expressed his unease in a more subtle way. "Be careful, son," he said during one of the few times he spoke up about the relationship. "Sometimes, things aren't always what they seem. Pay attention to what she values." However, Robert was in love. He believed that Betty loved him for who he was, not for what he had. Even so, the doubts planted by his family began to bother him. Nonetheless, Robert decided to move forward, convinced that love would overcome the differences. The relationship deepened, and what initially seemed like just an attraction transformed into a serious romance. Robert, always cautious with his decisions, saw in Betty the chance to build a life alongside someone he loved. Although she was different from everything he knew, Robert believed that the love between them would be enough to sustain a lasting relationship. Over time, the relationship between Robert and Betty deepened even further. Robert, always careful in his decisions, felt ready to take the next step. Despite the differences Betty brought into his life, he believed that their love was enough to overcome any obstacle. Betty's smiles and promises filled Robert's heart with hope. He knew she came from a different world, but still, he was determined to move forward. One day, during a carefully planned dinner, Robert decided that this would be the moment. In an elegant restaurant, lit by candles, the atmosphere seemed perfect. Robert was visibly nervous, trying to hide the tremor in his hands as he talked with Betty. She, always confident, was unaware of his unease, talking about a new trip she wanted to take. Finally, after a few glasses of wine, Robert took a deep breath, pulled a small box from his pocket, and with a shy smile, said, "Betty, I know our journey together has been full of surprises, but I believe in what we are building. I never imagined I would find someone like you who would change my life in such a significant way. So, I want to ask you, will you marry me?" Betty looked at Robert for a few seconds, clearly surprised, and then smiled. "Of course, Robert," she said, with a sparkle in her eyes. "I knew this day would come." She accepted the ring with elegance and joy, and the two celebrated the moment, which for Robert felt like the beginning of a promising future. In the days that followed, the couple dove into wedding preparations. Betty took control of nearly all the decisions, from the ceremony location to the details of the reception. For her, the event had to be perfect, filled with luxury and sophistication. Robert, on the other hand, was content to see her happy, although some of her choices felt strange to his family. "Does it really need to be so extravagant?" his mother asked in a conversation. "This doesn't seem like the Robert the first, no." Robert just smiled and replied, "Mom, I just want her to be happy. Don't worry, everything will be fine." However, weeks before the big day, Robert's life took an unexpected blow. The company he had worked for, his livelihood for so many years, began to face financial difficulties. Rumors that it might close reached the ears of the employees, but Robert, ever the optimist, believed things would work out. One day, however, the worst happened. During a meeting with the board, it was announced that the company would be shutting down. All employees, including Robert, would be laid off. The news hit Robert hard. It wasn't just the job he was losing, but the stability he had always valued. The thought of starting his married life without a source of income made him uneasy, but he knew that with his experience, he would find another opportunity. When he got home that night, he sat down with Betty on the couch and told her what had happened. He expected words of support, maybe a hug or some expression of understanding, but Betty's reaction was very different from what he imagined. "You lost your job," Betty said, with a tone of surprise but without hiding her discomfort. "Robert, this changes a lot. How are we going to maintain everything we planned? The wedding, the honeymoon, the house we want to buy. I can't believe this is happening now, just before the wedding." Robert, trying to stay calm, replied, "I know it's a tough situation, but I'll figure it out. I just need some time to find something new. We can adjust our plans temporarily." "But adjust how?" Betty shot back, clearly upset. "I wasn't expecting to have to make sacrifices. You know how much comfort means to me. And now, without a job, you want me to give up everything I dreamed of?" Betty's words echoed in Robert's mind. He knew she valued a comfortable life, but he had never realized how much it affected her. The coldness and calculation in her words left him stunned. In the days that followed, Betty became more distant. She continued with the wedding preparations, but the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about the future had vanished. Robert tried to ignore the change, telling himself it was just the stress of the moment. Deep down, however, an uncomfortable feeling began to grow within him. As the wedding day approached, the tension between the two only increased. Robert, still without a new job, felt the weight of responsibility piling up on his shoulders. He didn't want to disappoint Betty, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that the woman he was about to marry seemed more concerned with status and comfort than with the relationship itself. Even so, Robert pressed on, believing that things could improve over time. On the morning of the wedding, Robert woke up early. The sun hadn't even risen yet, but he was already up, walking through the small house he would soon leave behind. He looked at himself in the mirror, fixed his hair, and took a deep breath. "It's the big day," he murmured to himself, trying to contain the anxiety that was growing in his chest. Outside, everything was already in motion. The final preparations for the ceremony were underway, and in a few hours, he would be waiting for Betty at the altar, ready to begin what he believed would be the rest of his life alongside her. But deep in his heart, a shadow of doubt began to form. Robert knew something was different, but he still didn't know exactly what it would mean for him that day. Still wrapped in a mix of anxiety and hope, Robert prepared for one of the most important moments of his life. He looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. The well-pressed suit, the impeccable haircut, everything seemed in order, but inside, the whirlwind of thoughts left him restless. His family had been there early, helping with the final preparations. His mother, with an encouraging smile, approached and gave him a hug. "Everything is going to be okay, son," she said warmly. "You're doing the right thing." Despite the comforting words, something inside Robert still felt off. He sensed a tension in the air, an unease he couldn't explain. But at that moment, he chose to ignore the discomfort and focus on what was about to happen. When he arrived at the church, the setting was stunning. Flowers decorated the altar, and the pews were filled with friends and family. Robert, standing at the altar, looked at every detail, trying to keep calm. He exchanged smiles with some friends and silently repeated to himself that this would be the start of a new phase. The soft sound of music filled the air, and the murmur of guests brought a palpable sense of anticipation. Then, the church doors opened. All eyes turned to Betty, who looked breathtaking in her white dress, walking down the aisle. Robert felt his heart race. There she was, walking toward him with slow, elegant steps. But something in her eyes seemed different. The smile he expected wasn't there, and the sparkle in her eyes that once enchanted him seemed dimmed. As Betty approached, Robert felt the emotional distance between them grow, even though they were only a few feet apart physically. She finally reached the altar, but instead of smiling at Robert and taking his hand, Betty paused for a brief moment, looked at him with an unreadable expression, and then pulled something from inside her bouquet. "Robert," Betty said, her voice trembling as she handed him a small folded piece of paper. I'm so sorry." Before he could say anything, she turned her back and, in a quick and unexpected movement, ran down the aisle of the church toward the door. The murmur of the guests turned into a perplexed silence. Robert stood frozen, staring at the paper in his hand, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Shock immobilized him for a few seconds until, suddenly, he regained his senses and ran after her. When he reached the church door and looked outside, Betty had already disappeared. He heard the distant sound of a car accelerating and, when he looked in that direction, saw a luxury car turning the corner, too fast to catch up with. Robert stood at the entrance of the church, the paper still in his hand, unable to believe what had just happened. With his heart racing, he slowly unfolded the paper. With each line he read, reality hit him like a whirlwind. The letter was short but devastating. "Robert, I'm so sorry to do this, but I can't go through with this marriage. I thought I could, I thought the love I feel for you would be enough, but after you lost your job, I realized I can't live the simple life you can offer me now. I can't give up the comfort and luxury I've always wanted. I found someone who can give me that, someone who already has what I need. I'm so sorry, truly, but I have to follow what I believe is best for me. Betty." The words danced in Robert's mind as he struggled to process what he had just read. She left him. At the altar. She chose someone else. Someone who could provide her with the luxurious life he could no longer offer. The weight of betrayal crushed him. Robert stood there, staring into the void, trying to understand where everything had fallen apart. The love he felt for Betty now mingled with deep pain and disillusionment. Seeing the situation from afar, Robert's family soon came to his side. His mother, with tears in her eyes, tried to comfort him, holding him tightly. "I'm so sad for you, my son," she said, her voice choked with emotion. His father, more reserved, placed a hand on Robert's shoulder and said calmly, "You'll get through this, son. You're strong." Despite the unconditional support from his family, Robert felt completely lost. The feeling of rejection, the shame in front of the guests, and above all, the emotional devastation of being replaced by someone else, for something so material and superficial, was something he didn't know how to face. He thanked the family and friends who came close to offer words of comfort, but deep down, all he wanted was to be alone. Robert slowly walked to the car he had prepared to leave with Betty after the wedding. He sat in the back seat, staring into the emptiness, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. His thoughts raced in circles. Why? Why did Betty do this? The pain in his chest was overwhelming. He wanted answers, but deep down, he knew there was no explanation that could heal the void that now consumed him. That afternoon, Robert returned home. The day that should have been the happiest of his life had turned into his worst nightmare. He was emotionally devastated, his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. As he walked through the living room, he felt himself sinking deeper into the abyss of his own emotions. All Robert wanted at that moment was to isolate himself from the world, to distance himself from everyone, and try to understand how to start over after such a cruel abandonment. Some time passed since that fateful day when Robert was left at the altar. The first few months after the incident were the most difficult of his life. Robert isolated himself, avoiding contact with friends and even with his own family. He spent days reclusive, trying to process what had happened, struggling against the pain and the feeling of betrayal. But, as time always does, the wounds began to heal, albeit slowly. Little by little, Robert started to rise again in an attempt to rebuild the life that had collapsed so suddenly. One day, while at home, he received a visit from a lawyer, someone he didn't recognize. "Mr. Robert?" the lawyer said as he knocked on the door. Robert nodded, surprised. "My name is Jason, and I am the lawyer handling your grandfather's estate. I'm here to discuss some matters that I believe will interest you." Robert was in shock. He hardly knew the details of his grandfather's life in recent years. However, during his childhood, he had a very close relationship with his grandfather. Old Paul was a man of few words but many teachings. He lived on a small farm in the mountains, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Robert spent much of his summer vacations there, learning life lessons. His grandfather had always been a solid figure in his life, someone he could count on, even though distance had increased over time. He remembered the walks through the fields, the stories told, and the simple yet profound advice. "The world changes, Robert," his grandfather used to say. "But never forget who you are. Material things come and go, but character is what defines you." Robert missed those times, but he never imagined that his seemingly simple grandfather had accumulated any kind of fortune. Now, in front of the lawyer, Robert heard something that surprised him deeply. His grandfather had left him a considerable inheritance, a sum that suddenly transformed him into a wealthy man. Jason explained all the details. Your grandfather, Paul, was a very prudent man. He always knew how to manage his business well and made smart investments over the years. And he always believed that you were the only one who would understand the true value of what he had accumulated. Robert was speechless. Life seemed to have taken a turn. Everything he had lost, all the suffering caused by Betty's betrayal and the loss of his job, now seemed insignificant in light of this new reality. Although money wouldn't erase the past, it gave Robert the chance to rebuild his life in a completely new way. Years passed, and Robert took advantage of this new phase in his life to rise again. He invested in businesses that truly interested him, traveled to places he had never imagined he would see, and, most importantly, learned to appreciate the people who had always stood by him. His grandfather's fortune provided him with many opportunities, but Robert never forgot the lessons of humility and honesty that had been passed down to him. He became a successful man but remained true to his principles, the ones his grandfather had instilled in his heart since childhood. Amidst this new life, Robert ended up meeting someone special, a woman named Emily. Unlike Betty, Emily was a person with a pure heart, interested in what truly mattered, Robert's character and the genuine love they shared. Emily brought back the spark that Robert had lost, and with her, he finally felt that he could be happy again. However, life still had one last surprise in store. A few years later, when Robert was completely emotionally healed and living in full happiness with Emily, he received an unexpected visit. It was Betty. She looked visibly different, with an expression of weariness and regret that Robert never imagined he would see on her face. "Robert," she said, her voice fragile and hesitant. I don't know where to begin. I made a terrible mistake. When I left you, I thought I was making the right choice for my life, but I was wrong. The life I thought I would have with that man didn't happen. He left me shortly after we ran away. I was alone, with nothing. I wanted to ask for forgiveness. I don't know what I was thinking back then." Robert looked at her in silence, absorbing the words she spoke. Betty continued, tears in her eyes. "I was a fool. I thought money was the answer to everything. Now I see how wrong I was. Please, forgive me. I wanted to come back. I know I made a mistake, but I wanted a second chance." Robert remained calm, different from the emotionally shattered man he had been a few years ago. He had moved on from the past, and Betty's presence at that moment didn't shake him like before. After a brief silence, he responded, his voice firm yet gentle, "Betty, I'm very sorry that you went through all of that. But that life we had, it no longer exists. I've moved on. I learned a lot from what happened, and I appreciate you coming to ask for forgiveness. But I can't go back. I found someone who truly loves me for who I am, not for what I have. I'm happy now, and I don't want to relive the past." Robert's words hit Betty like a blow, and she lowered her head in silence. She knew there was no turning back, that her chance with Robert had been destroyed the moment she abandoned him at the altar. With nothing more to say, Betty said her goodbyes and left, disappearing from Robert's life, this time for good. Robert, on the other hand, returned to his home, where Emily was waiting for him. He had built a new life, a life based on true love. He knew that despite all the challenges, the future would be bright alongside someone who truly valued him for who he was, not for what he could offer. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.